Welcome everybody to our webinar today called Benefiting from Software Transparency from SBOM to Vulnerability and Management. I am Seth Carmody, your esteemed host. With me today I have an incredible colleague and partner, Kyle Erickson, in this security journey, of which there are many things to take care of. SBOM seems to be on a topic on everybody's mind today for a variety of reasons that we're going to dig into today. Welcome, Kyle Erickson. Maybe a introduction is in order. Kyle, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, it's Kyle Erickson. I'm the Senior Director of Cardiac Rhythm Management, Cybersecurity. I'm actually embedded in a research and development team, and we're charged from cradle to grave cybersecurity across the whole product portfolio. And I'm excited to talk about SBOM. It's something that I think is scary to us manufacturers, but I think there's ways that we can leverage it to our benefit, and we can dig into that here today. So thanks for having me, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. A pleasure to have you. I'm Seth Carmody, VP of Regulatory Strategy at MedCrypt, formerly at FDA. For folks who don't know, I help to architect the cybersecurity policies that the agency is trying to implement and hold people accountable to, and we're all trying to work collectively towards. So I think we'll dive right in here, Kyle, unless you have some soliloquy or pre-interview rant. But I think the question is, I think what we want to do really is kind of level set a little bit, like not pretend everybody knows what an SBOM is, but maybe from your perspective, like what is it, where did it come from? Maybe we could just start there.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bias, and when I think about SBOM, I go back to DevOps and software teams that have built systems that have been assembled from code, right? Modern software is not written from scratch anymore. It's a number of components put together, and really that's what you're trying to get with a software bill of materials and dependency management. And they're really important pieces in the build process for software, but now they're becoming necessary for us to understand what's in our products. And if we're able to understand what's in our products, we can do proper vulnerability management. And today, I think that the medical device industry is still coming up to speed with how we do that, how we scale that. And I think that's what's scary to us manufacturers. We see a software bill of materials and we start to think, oh, this is going to be unnecessary transparency to our customers. They're going to ask a million questions when they see one component or one operating system at a certain version. So for me, I always go back to the origin in my mind, and that was traditional software development and traditional pretty much IT security, where we had to look at what was the product of our complex system. And if you think about it, traditionally, medical devices, specifically in my space, it was a pacemaker, and you maybe wrote some firmware code, right? And you had a pacing algorithm, and you had detection there. But a lot of that was built in-house. And you now start to scale this to something like remote patient monitoring that goes from maybe a more complex implant to an instrument or a mobile app and into the cloud. Now you have this massive set of dependencies that you're relying on. And that's really, I think, why we're seeing the increase and scrutiny around software bill of materials.
Yeah, and speaking of that, and I love the idea of transitioning. Like one of the terms that I was introduced to when I joined the FDA was SOUP, right? The software of unknown dominance, or choose your favorite, flavor of acronym, right? This concept of I don't know what's in it, but it works for us, right? So I think there's very much is this transition. So I love your perspective of coming from a place where it's just sort of part of doing business and leading the change, right? And showing the value. Speaking of the change, where is that coming from? Like, from your perspective, I mean, we all have our perspectives. We hear it a lot. Where do you think the market incentives and forces are coming from?
Definitely, we obviously see it from regulation, right? We see it from the National Cybersecurity Executive Order and what NTIA put out there around what an SBOM should look like, and that's broader. But I think we're trying to see that as far as internal pressures with our governance teams, with our quality teams, with our compliance teams, bringing that in, because we know that at some point, it's going to be a mandate from our regulators, but also a mandate from our customers. So see the market forces on both ends. We're trying to get ahead of it, though. I think we're really trying to take an approach where we look back at not only new products, but our legacy products and see what it takes to build out these SBOMs.
Yeah, and you know, coming from my perspective as a regulator who architected a policy which called on us to do SBOMs, you know, it was a fundamental part of risk management, right? The idea that these are sources of risk. And we see in the news, right, like supply chain attacks are sort of in vogue right now. And you know, paying attention to risk from software supply chain sort of is real, and we absolutely need to figure out ways to address it, right? Um, so
Let me
yeah,
add one thing to that, Seth, right? Like that supply chain point is really good, because we can't protect what we can't see or what we don't know about. And if we're not digging deeper into our components and dependencies, we're never going to detect a supply chain attack until an adverse event happens, right? So.
and even when you have an event, right, like, and whether it's an adverse event or maybe just like function, you know, operationally something's compromised, doesn't work anymore, it's not available. um, how you respond to that, right? This idea that we've been talking about, sort of management, vulnerability management, but also an incident response, right? Maybe you could, you know, talk about SBOM role and incident response as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it goes back to visibility. It goes back to observability, and an incident response is all about containing a blast radius, right? And if you don't know what the root cause is or where the intrusion is happening or what is being exploited, how are you to contain a blast radius, right? And so I think that's something, I cut my teeth on incident response back when Heartbleed was a thing, right? And we were looking at literally every product, every instrument, every utility that ran OpenSSL. And that was an exercise in futility without having inventory, software bill of materials, the components that make up the different dependencies on our firewalls and our infrastructure. And so, learning from the past, right, we can get ahead of that in medical device, even though we're behind in as far as vulnerability management is concerned. We can get ahead of that by adopting things like SBOM and being more transparent with them.
Yeah, makes total sense. I think the one example that I lived through wasn't, well, I was at the agency when Heartbleed happened, and certainly was a topic of discussion, sort of in our infancy in terms of thought patterns around cybersecurity. But WannaCry was a big one, right? That sort of opened my eyes to the idea of having pre-positioned information, automated systems, right? Scaled systems to help us answer the question, like, where am I affected? Am I affected? And then if I am, like, where is that? So that we could help our customers, right, who are sort of deploying these things and on the front lines. We have, there was this sort of synergy that had to happen, that was necessitated, or that was facilitated by having the information pre-positioned. The idea that you have to go find it while you're being, under duress is, not suboptimal, I guess is the best way to say it.
Absolutely.
So I think, like, there's when I look at and think about sort of SBOM, you can think about sort of producing one. You can think about matching that information that you have in the SBOM, so the individual software entries, to known vulnerability information, or information that you have is internally, like private information about vulnerabilities. Figuring out what you're going to do about it, and then telling appropriate stakeholders about it. Sort of the four main buckets of it. It can be kind of simple. That seems simple, and I think it belies some of the complexity. Maybe we could talk about that, and then maybe where we could point people to start. Like, if they're just getting started on their journey, like where could they aim their resources at?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump into starting, because we've been along this journey for probably a year and a half now on how we're going to do this at scale, and we like to take the approach of a series of some experiments, right? If you look at our ecosystem, I kind of referenced it when I talked about how we went from an implant to a more complex system. We're looking at two totally different ends of the spectrum and two totally different problems. In a more traditional software product, there's a lot of tooling and automation that can happen there, right? And that's really what we want to get to, is automated analysis, automated generation, automated disposition of risk, and then you bring the human in, right, to start to prioritize and make the determinations with your risk management framework. But I think where you got to start is take a really old product that's still in the field and take something that's pretty new, And you're going to learn that it's much more difficult to do certain things, even just SBOM generation on an older customized product versus maybe something that's using traditional software development practices and can be just created through automation or through something like you know, a dependency management tool or supply chain management tool in software. So those are the two ways that I would start, because you're going to learn a lot. And then you got to think about what are you learning and how can that scale, because you're going to start to get a lot of information out of that. And what we don't want to have happen is SBOM just create information. We want SBOM to be the tool to help drive risk management and to make informed decisions on where to apply mitigation or patch or updates. Because if we looked at anybody's network, right, any traditional IT network, and we pulled their last scan results, there's going to be vulnerabilities everywhere, right? But there's ways that they've taken risk management approaches and mitigations, and they've just positioned that risk or adjudicated those vulnerabilities and decided what to patch. And they have cycles for that. We're going to have to adopt that same approach, and it just becomes hygiene that we constantly do. But to get started, I think you got to look at some real world examples and just dig in and start to generate an SBOM.
Yeah, it's a great point. I love the concept of, like, you know, we're driving towards this sort of dynamic nature, right? That we're just going to have to take a model from someplace else that does it, even in its imperfection, I guess, and sort of apply it here and adapt it for our industry. You and I have had conversations before about where this industry struggles with being dynamic and patching and making updates and sort of continuous operation, right? Because we came out of that safety culture where we make sure the thing works 1,000 times out of 1,000 times, right? And we never need to really touch it again unless, you know, there's something that comes out from post-market issue, some post-market issue. Maybe you can talk about how we're, you know, evolving as an industry to become more dynamic and support, you know, from whatever perspective, maybe from the device itself or the ecosystem itself, to support more of a continuous or dynamic software delivery, or like updates, or like how are we doing in that regard?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with verification and validation, right? We got to make sure we're not breaking things with updates, and that's really, really important in certain products in our industry, right? Things that, based on classification or the nature of the product, might have more constraints, right? I think what I try to do is look for win-wins. One thing we haven't really talked a lot about with SBOM is, how can this help the post-market quality teams? How can this help the teams that are in charge of like system reliability? Like, there are things beyond cybersecurity, you know, risk mitigation that you can find in an SBOM. And I think if you can start to weave that in with current processes or development cycle, we're going through an initiative really to automate a lot of our build and deploy processes, right? We're on a DevOps journey for that, but we got to find those hooks where we can find that, you know, balance between supporting teams on post market and then getting this more traditionally into the culture and into the release process for general build and deploy. And I think we do have a unique, you know, need. We're not going to probably release like Amazon or Google and run like multiple releases every day, right? We're just not going to get there with medical devices.
Sure.
So we do need to take that kind of scalpel approach to what are we patching, what are we mitigating, and the SBOM is going to be the first step in really making that stuff visible. So I think it's a combination of finding the win-wins where this can be beneficial outside of just security, hooking it into your current build processes, and helping it also improve your build and deploy processes, right, for fixes. And then really, when we're doing it, we can't just drop a list of 1 million vulnerabilities on the development team's plate and say, sorry, you got to fix all these in the next release. It's just, that's untenable for us. And it's actually really untenable for anyone. So there needs to be tools and capabilities to be better about what we're patching. And I think exploitability and other mechanisms can really help us better understand that.
I think we could have probably a separate webinar on the concept of exploitability. So maybe that'll be like the follow-on. So the idea that there are traditional parts of the organization, just, you know, I'm not picking on our quality friends, but like, you know, people that are tried and true, like medical device manufacturing for decades, and know their stuff, you know, the win-win, you're talking about creating win-wins for them. Like, how can they benefit from doing an SBOM so that they, you know, they get on board? I think the idea of approaching from a quality perspective, that you could even, you know, choose better quality suppliers, right, by tracking over time the kind of issues that you have to deal with from your software suppliers. Maybe you could comment on that.
Absolutely. I think, making similar to like what we did with the disclosures, right? With vulnerability disclosure, making sure our vendors have vulnerability disclosure. The same thing could be true for SBOM, right? Making sure we're getting a proper bill of materials from the components and dependencies that they might be using. If we're using an OEM or whatever, right? Like to really understand that through the whole supply chain. I think that's incredibly important, and that can help inform design decisions. It can help with security design decisions, but it can also, make it more visible when we have an issue to understand where we could go to make that fix. And I think that's the visibility that sometimes we do lack in all of our post-market processes, and we're usually kind of more manual with it. And you brought up soup, right? Soup is a perfect example. We have a ceremony around reviewing the software of unknown province, right? Like if we could get better about automating that, that would save time, effort, and energy for those teams that are on the reliability and post-market side of having to support this, because it's written, it's codified, right? I can't remember which standard that is. My team would be kicking me right now. I'm sure there's a couple people that know it off the top, but it's codified that we have to do that for medical device software development lifecycle. So can we speed that up? Can we improve that? And beyond just the security and vulnerability analysis side of it, the hygiene, right? That brings.
You mentioned design decisions. That was one that I hadn't thought about too deeply, and in recent conversations that I've had with folks, it's come up more and more that while sort of SBOM is not a panacea solution for cybersecurity, it's definitely something we should do because it has these direct effects. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about maybe impacts that it's had on design decisions, where you're choosing, you're assembling software goods, right, to some clinical end. How does that SBOMing or keeping track of that, what you're using, help you to make better sort of maybe security architecture decisions? Can you talk about that?
I think a lot about a connected system that needs updatability, right?
Yes.
And you can look at the track record of versions and patching, and that could be for two reasons. That could be, hey, I want to find a vendor that is giving me a quick update when there's an SoC vulnerability in Bluetooth, right? Or it could be, I'm looking at an operating system that I want to trust for 10 years. That's going to be something that I will push continuous updates to through the life cycle of my programmer, right? And I think that those are ways that you can make design decisions. You can look at the history, you can look at the vulnerabilities. Again, there's other aspects of that, right? You got to look at the vendor and how often do they do disclosure. You got to look at their patching cycle. Microsoft's a perfect example. We get it every Tuesday in the month, or every second Tuesday of the month, right? But you can make design decisions based on a lot of that from a security standpoint. But the other aspects of it too is how often are you going to have off ramps to be able to patch, right? Are you customizing the upstream source, and are you making poor decisions there? I feel like if you're going to take operating systems like that off the shelf, you're going to have a good plan for how you're maintaining them, and you're going to have to understand kind of what their cadence is for patching. And that could be because of security, it could also be because of just support and general operations of that system. And so we've taken different approaches throughout the years at Medtronic, where we've maybe completely customized an operating system. Now we have to do our own kind of customized build. We have to take derivative dependencies and fill them in. And then we've also flipped that around in a more recent, device and said, no, we're going to be, vetting the new operating system patch, but we're going to be basically allowing the system to take that latest update and just make sure that the app that we build on top of it can interact with it, longer term. So I think those are design decisions that you could leverage SBOM, as well as just kind of generally disclosure and patch management capabilities from the upstream source.
Well, and how do outside of sort of the design teams, right? Like, and maybe the people that are going to be responsible for maintaining that device once it's released, how has those been resonant messages and value add for executive leadership? Say people that are very focused on selling clinical features, which makes sense, right? The latest and greatest clinical algorithm, or other parts of the business, legal, whatever. Have you found any of this messaging resonant, or what have you? I guess the better question is, what have you found to be resonant within this messaging to do SBOM and to create buy-in for different parts of the organization, which may not think about it, right, or know intrinsically what the value is?
Yeah, I think it's been a challenge, right, to go from saying like, this is an SBOM, this is what it is, to really like, what is the value longer term? I think one thing that we don't talk about a lot is total cost of ownership. And I think SBOM can drive transparency into total cost of ownership and maintainability and updatability. Back to your question just previously about what's it going to take to support, how often, what are they doing from a patching standpoint, on the upstream source. I think that it's also going to be a value proposition for our customers. Our customers are going to be driving a lot of this discussion to our field staff, the people that are interacting with clinicians and patients and doctors that are going to be using the technology. Their governance teams or IT security teams are going to be asking for SBOM. That's also going to be driving this, right? And so the value proposition of getting ahead of it and having a program and having a plan to, meet those asks effectively and keeping operational security in mind, because again, we don't want to give a roadmap to hack all our devices, but we do want to have a certain set of transparency when the responsibility might be in the hands of IT security or in the clinician security teams to protect the product. So I think you're going to have drivers both for total cost of ownership and lifecycle management and getting that transparent over the cost of the product, or the life of the product and the total cost. And then when you're seeing it from demand from customers in the field and they're asked for it. And you know what, we didn't even talk about your space, right? The regulators requiring this, right, to be, maintained, and what comes like longer term for, future guidance and future requirements there.
Yeah, there's a lot here. I'll touch on your last point first. Coming from the regulator perspective, I mean, the FDA's regulatory purview is, protecting and promoting the public health. Anytime a vulnerability comes out, like let's take the one that happened over the summer, like QNX. I think it was the Bluetooth one. I think that was the latest one was Bracktooth. The question really is for a regulator is I don't know what the overall public health risk of any of those vulnerabilities. I think there was a GPS one that just came out. Those are really, really hard, amazingly complex questions to answer for a public health regulator. And I think, you see it in policy, and the impetus for policy is having SBOMs, from your business unit, other business units, aggregated up to Medtronic and other businesses, corporate wide, allows us to start to answer questions in the aggregate, like what's the overall health risk? Not to be pejorative or say, shame on you, because vulnerabilities are part of the supply chain, but how can we get our arms around the risk that that comes out? So that's my perspective as a regulator. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the risk is never zero, right, in security, but it's how do we know where to effectively apply mitigation, and we've patched systems that have been complex and older, and we need a risk management framework and a transparency, right, to understand when, right, to apply those resources in that time. And to your point, like that's what, as a regulator, you want to know, do you trust this device manufacturer to be able to assess the risk, have transparency to what's within the system, and apply the right mitigations or patch, right, if you have to actually effectively protect the public safety, right? And I think we have a responsibility as manufacturers to do that. We also have a responsibility to use those resources appropriately, not patch everything, right? Patch the right things. And it starts with having the transparency to what's in your system to do that.
Do you think we have a good, is there good data out there on total cost of ownership for security in general, like doing security and doing parts of security? Or are we still learning? Like, where do you think we're at from a data perspective? Can I go grab a report and say, see, total cost of ownership is lower for doing these things? Do we have that, or do we need some more work in that area?
I think we need some more work in that area. I have my experiences and maybe some bias built into it, but we've been able to at least look at the cost of some of the debt that's built up over the years that has turned into major field corrective actions for us, right? Where if we were potentially like looking at patching throughout the life cycle and looking at better understanding the risk and qualifying that risk more appropriately, I think we would have been in a better place with that kind of incremental improvement. And I think we'd also be able to say, okay, it's going to cost X over 10 years, and I'm not even getting into the obsolescence piece of this, which is a whole nother monster, right? But over, let's just say, a finite set of years to maintain it from a hygiene standpoint. Or you're just going to set it and forget it and not do anything to it, now you're going to have these large scale issues, whether they come up through major vulnerabilities or actual, incidents or other reasons that are driving that. And the cost is so much greater then, right? Because we have to go back, we have to maybe put in half mitigations, things that are not as good as if we were maintaining it through its life cycle. And there's always going to be exceptions to that, right? Like the way we design certain systems might be different. The way we designed systems 10 years ago might be different. So we're still kind of in this limbo period where, we kind of have two different ecosystems and two different schools of thought. Before secure by design was really like important, and kind of after, right, where we're thinking about updatability and detectability and visibility to the products, right, continuously. And so hopefully, the newer thinking and the newer requirements we're building in and the newer capabilities will come with, additional controls and additional hygiene throughout the life cycle. So we shouldn't have this bolus of old products that really, honestly, security researchers came and brought forth, and as they should have, right, to our faces and said, you guys need to fix this, right? So I think that we need more data, back to your original question, but I think, probably a consortium of medical device manufacturers could put something together that gave some perspective there.
Great. That'll be our next one of our next topics is assembling that consortium. Yeah, I do think we need more data around it. So I look, anything we can get, because I think that it's there, right? I think that's the hypothesis, right? And maybe we have an anecdote or two that bears that out. And by the way, when I used to speak on behalf of the, when I was at the FDA, I would always say, it's like, look, we have security debt because we never thought about it, right? We were hyper focused on clinical, and we're in a transition period, right? So it's going to be painful. So if you designed a system 20 years ago, right, and it has some security debt, I'm not surprised. It's not that you didn't do your job. It's just that it wasn't part of the it wasn't part of the scope of work, so to speak. So I do, before I transition to, you mentioned a roadmap, and I want to transition to the topic of risks, because I do think it's super important. There's been some articles come out over the last National Cybersecurity Awareness Month that spoke to this, that there is some risk. So before we dig into that, though, I know we have some attendees here. Maybe I'll open it for questions for any of the topics that we've discussed so far. And I don't know how comfortable, Kyle, you are with silence, but I don't stay here for like 10 minutes till somebody comes in with a question.
Just force that silence on everyone else and make them uncomfortable.
I'm fine. Like, I'm doing fine over here. So we'll see what happens. Any questions or thoughts, comments on anything that's been discussed so far? I always find the willingness to ask questions very interesting in the online space. I can't wait till we're back to can't wait till we're back to in-person stuff. So as an anecdote, while people are thinking about questions, and then maybe we'll pivot to risks. I did go out and do a conference. It was the first time a year and a half in person, and there were 35 minutes of questions, and we had to cut it off, right? Like, there was just a nonstop discussion. So maybe just people were either hungry for cybersecurity medical device information from me, or they just were like, can we interact? Like, there's a person in front of us talking. Maybe that was part of it. Don't know. All right. No takers on the questions. Maybe we should start talking about risk, because I think this is an interesting space. So this idea of roadmap for attackers is really interesting, right? The idea that by having an SBOM and I guess disclosing it, making that information known, I'm being as broad as possible, comes with risk. And what are those risks in your opinion? Oh, now we have questions. Okay. I'll throw you the question. Like, talk about the risks. I'll read the questions and see if we can't tie some stuff in. So what are the risks in your mind? What are we dealing with here? It's not risk-free. Where does it come from? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, I'll kind of speak biasly from the manufacturer perspective, right? So I think a couple things that come to mind. Just like disclosures, you want to have some kind of mitigation or patch ready, right? So if you're giving intricate information about a product and weaknesses in the product, or weaknesses that could be derived from the product, you want to make sure that you have that risk understood. And if you're sharing that risk, right, you want to make sure that that's in some sort of forum that that gives you some level of protection, right? Like, I mean, if we look at adversaries with the right intent, capability, and resources, they can find this information out, whether we disclose it or not. But I think we want to make it a little bit higher hurdle for someone who wants to maliciously exploit a system or product than just dropping our SBOMs anywhere on the internet, right? So I think there's operational security considerations there. Again, I'm not naive to the fact that people can get at it from other ways. I think the other piece, and this is again selfish from a manufacturer's perspective, we get 150 questionnaires from our customers on the regular from every system that we might have, and some of the questions may not be applicable at all. Some of them may be right on target because we're in the cloud or something specific to an assessment there. But when we start to go down the path of like pulling threads on components and really asking detailed questions that just really disrupt the cycle of getting product into market, into the field, I mean, it makes it a lot more difficult. And I can see that being a barrier for many manufacturers to say, hey, if I give you too much information, you're going to go down a rabbit hole and we're never going to get through the risk assessment process. So how do we figure out a way to like have some trust, talk about risk management, talk about how we handle vulnerabilities, talk about why they're not as concerning within the architecture, the design, or other mitigation that we might have, because that's a risk of, I think, manufacturers not being as transparent.
So you're saying that there's a risk from not lack of transparency, but you got to hit the right level of transparency in order to minimize some of the risks
Yes.
that you're discussing, like downstream sales. But there is some like so one of the things two things. One thing is like how we do disclosure today. We publish everything to the web. I think that's an okay start. Which it's actually interesting that we chose that mechanism because it's fully public, right? I don't know if we would re-envision that, but it is what it is. The idea that you blast things out to the internet, but we need to get more targeted, I think, is probably the next evolution. So I think that gives people consternation. There's definitely some apprehension about, hey, we have a vulnerability. Right now, the practice is to disclose like to your website or leverage resources like ICS cert. Also, the 2018 draft pre-market guidance from the FDA shop, one of the things they latched onto, and one of the things I had to think about when I was writing policy was attaching it the forcing function to give it to customers was labeling regulations, and I think that touched off a whole bunch of stuff because that was sort of forcing folks to just essentially make it public, and I think invoked some of the risks that you're talking about.
Definitely a parallel there.
So we're not done with the risk category for sure. Maybe we could pivot back to in a second. I think there's some questions about, and actually Mahida had asked for about what's the right balance. So I think we talked a little bit about that. Some ROI stuff, questions coming through like, yeah, do we think, is it, see, how do you go about proving the ROI and investing in security from the beginning versus doing it from the after the fact? Is it truly dollars and cents, or is it a cultural change? I would say or, right? Like there's probably a mixture of both, right? How are you? We talked a little bit about it. Maybe we need more data, but how are you thinking about that question?
No, I think it's both. I think the cultural problem gets back to it being about hygiene and how longer term we need to be thinking about these products from cradle to grave. And I think that dollars and cents are also difficult to quantify, at least in my finance models and the way we do accounting. So I think that that's something that we're always pushing back on, whether it be for cybersecurity or continuous software development or services or models that are a little bit different than our traditional business model. So I think that it's not as cut and dry as like, oh yeah, here's the raw dollar amount if you patch today versus patching 6 months down the road. And it's also not just about, oh, we're all just going to be on board with the same culture around cybersecurity because it's the right thing to do. It's going to be a balance of the two, and they're going to drive different factors depending on who you're talking to. And again, that goes back to win-wins for the ops team and the post-market team around hygiene and automating some of this and making it faster. And then a win for the development team looking at what happens when it's in post-market and the total life cycle, and are we saving money by being more hygienic throughout the life of the product.
Yeah, I think it's certainly complex. I would love to be able to write a paper. Like, if I could sit down and write a paper about it, I would love to do that. So, if any takers out there, maybe we'll that's that consortium idea. We'll write a paper together. Um, I, here's a question about magnitude of cost savings. So you talk about like getting from getting started. It's probably a manual process, like trying to put the parts together and pieces together and talk to the right folks. What's the cost savings in like optimizing those types of processes, either going from like manual to automated? Do you have a sense of like magnitude? Is it 10 times savings, 100 times savings? Is it something different? What do you think?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I can quantify it by like a 5-10x, but I think that, it's gonna be, again, like, what is your coordinates here? So if it's over a certain period of time and you're doing manual soup reviews like every quarter or twice a year, and you're having to go through and manually look up vulnerabilities and their impact and manually score them, I think you'll be able to take people hours and equate that into, okay, I can bump it up against these sources. I have an automated, check every time something updates, right? I think you'll start to see kind of a better way to quantify that. I would say I'd have a hard time giving you exactly that dollar figure, but something we need to work on as we kind of go through it with our journey, because it's definitely something we're trying to sell as a benefit for
Sure.
SBOM.
Yeah, I think starting with the labor force, like how many hours does it take to do any particular task? And are there things that can be automated or streamlined or optimized that lead to fewer, right?
Yep.
So they can go work on something different. Um, I'm going to skip the question about selecting cybersecurity software for medical devices. Maybe we'll put that pin that to the end. I got a question here from Phil Fisk. Hey Phil, how you doing? About how far down the dependency tree that we need to go. Phil, hopefully I captured that well enough. Great question. Kyle, what's your opinion?
I mean, I think that we need to go as far down as possible longer term, right? So I want to think like start somewhere, experimentation, right? Get it going, figure out what works, whether that's framework, tools, the way you derive your SBOM. But if we look at some true supply chain attacks, if we really want to get at the root of this and have full transparency as a manufacturer, even into what's being compiled into our code and what are up and downstream sources if we're using open source, right? Like that is going to be where I think we see the longest term benefit of this from a traditional operational security perspective. And again, not just having an SBOM for compliance, having it to drive your incident response, drive your vulnerability management, target where you patch, right? Contain the blast radius like we talked about. So we do need to go as far down the source as possible. And I know there are some techniques and tools and people trying to solve for this. If you got ideas though, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. You got to start someplace. One hop. I think the NTIA and folks there were referring it to hops. One hop is a good place to start. When they would ask me when I was at the FDA, I would say, well, where's the vulnerability? How many hops away is it? Right? We got to find that. If our mechanisms do not go to the depth that unearths the vulnerability, we've missed the mark. But I do think there's a maturation or crawl walk run part of this that we need to get started. Focus on getting our muscle memory and people, process, and technologies in place to do it, and then evolve it, right? And I think the industry is, from what I've seen, willing to collaborate and figure it out together. NTIA being one of the forums for it.
Well, and to some of the points you're talking about earlier, it also might be different depending on what product or what technology stack or the system itself. And it might be easier to go further down the rabbit hole in a traditional software product versus a standalone, maybe bedside monitor that might have, a headless base and, a telemetry chip and, Wi-Fi, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, so it really probably depends on the product. And I hate to give you that answer, but that's why I think you got to experiment and like look at the different ends of the spectrum based on your products in your portfolio.
I'm gonna guess that a surgical robot probably has a few more ingredients than some other products. So
Absolutely.
complexity will vary. Now, good question, Phil. Thank you. I think getting back to the risks, potential solutions. Um, is there a way to control for the sort of unfettered release of SBOM information? Is there something we can do about it, I guess, or a way to control who has access to that information while still supplying the level of transparency we need to facilitate and extract all the value that we believe is latent within doing this, going through this effort?
Yeah, I think, we need to have a fight club for this information, right? And we need to have a way to some degree, vet individuals that have access to it. I think it would be concerning to me if we just put it out publicly everywhere. And so I think that there needs to be a way to at least just set the hurdle a little higher to get access to it. And I'm not sure, I don't have a solution for that. I think we just need to be very cognizant about the ways that we distribute that. And again, we're not going to control, it's not like we're going to have a DRM on an SBOM and, you can only open it with, multi-factor authentication. But my point being, like, let's not have it be on a public facing site and then really it just becomes fodder for people to poke at anywhere, where I think let's find the intended audiences and be a little bit more direct with it.
I think one of the other pieces, and you touched on this a little bit, the idea that let's not do SBOMs to be compliant, right? Let's let SBOMs be a catalyst and drive other good within the organization. I think, and this was a big thing when I was thinking through policy on SBOM, was it has to be machine readable, right? Because the idea that, to your point, like if you're handing off a PDF, whether it's public facing or in a trusted channel, right? The idea that then I have to take it and do something with it in order to reduce risk is really important. If I have a PDF, it's not to say that I can't, it's just harder, right? There's still manual processes that have to be done once the handoffs happen. So making sure that we can build systems that are interoperable, right? That are automated, that we can connect in and plug in this information such that we reduce the amount of manual friction. Like the idea of making it is not the end goal, right? The idea is not just to come up with a list, it's to make it actionable and get people to do things about it, right? That's the idea. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct, right? Like, again, I think of, if you're just making it, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or a PowerPoint, and just saying, yep, we did an SBOM, that's just compliance. But we want this to drive security and proper vulnerability management. And at scale, again, back to at scale. And so to your point about, you were spot on with making it machine readable, because it needs to be ingestible into tools. It needs to be continuously assessed and bumped up against whatever source you're using, NVD or others. It needs to kind of come back in and inform teams that are pen testing or deploying dynamic application security testing or deploying other things. It should be just like a threat model, another tool that gives you an understanding of the weaknesses in the product or the dependencies that might have weaknesses in the product. And I think if it's just like you said, a PDF or just something to say we did it, we're missing the mark in the overall goal. It's only going to be there as a compliance checkbox. And that's not what we want to do. I think we want to drive the discussion for proper hygiene and actual vulnerability management with it.
With the only caveat that if somebody asks us for a PDF, we could produce it, right? Like,
yeah. Hey, file formats and exportability, we can write, we got a lot of people that know Python. We can make it any format you want. So
love it. Very cool. So yeah, I think the idea that we can reduce risk of, and control exposure and get it in the hands of people who need it in a way that they can then take it and be actionable with it is, we can do it. I don't think we're there yet. Are we there yet? Or is this part of the evolution that we're, that this is part of the journey that we're on? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's part of the journey. I think, again, we're still experimenting with it. We're still looking at it at scale. We're still making sure it's driving the right behaviors with our implementation of it. We're not 100% there, right? We're still finding ways that our system and our process might need to change a little bit when we look at the volume of things that come off of it. And so I think that is part of the journey, right? But you got to start somewhere. You got to start building them. You got to start looking at them. You got to start bumping them up against vulnerability databases. You got to start understanding your products more. You're going to bring more engineers in. It can't just be a security job, right? Because if you have 50 products that you're protecting, there's no way a small security team is going to be able to know all the nuance, all the ins and outs, all the ways that those components are called. You're going to need software developers, firmware developers, device engineers, systems engineers. You need more people to help you with this analysis. But again, we don't want to just make it manual, right? We got to find the ways and the processes to allow it to scale and to bring them in at the right times and to be able to do the right analysis and develop the ceremonies and process around it. Otherwise, again, it's just going to be a backlog, and we don't want a backlog of vulnerabilities.
Well said. Couple questions in here about like Dependabot. So I think I'm gonna pivot at the end to Dependabot and other cybersecurity software. Question here from Axel. A typical adversary develops. Can you see the questions, by the way?
Yeah, I can. Yep.
Do you enjoy me reading them to you?
Yeah, that's great.
Great.
Makes it more official.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Typical adversary develops exploits targeting a specific vulnerability and then scans the internet for systems that match. They're typically not looking to attack a specific device and then find a vulnerability in that device. Can we therefore conclude that the operational security advantages for SBOM exceed the risk due to disclosure?
I would say that is pretty much 100% correct as far as how we've seen traditional exploitation. But I think when we're thinking about certain use cases, certain adversarial scenarios, there might be a reason why a high value target, or for another reason, somebody might look at a particular device. And again, I don't want to go to only the high value target scenario because that is a super edge case, but that's something that we need to be considering, right, within our threat modeling. I think that there's a good point about it exceeding some of the risk, but if you have a really old product that you're going to have maybe some components come back out of your SBOM and they're not all fully functioning in the same way as the upstream source, you might have some false positives in there too that might drive some concern and some risk. And again, this is selfishly from the manufacturer's perspective, and we have to do a good job of making sure that that's transparent, how we're dispositioning that risk and how we're presenting that. So I think I go back to that as still the operational security concern from our end. But the point is valid that we could probably be very targeted with the types of products. Now, if I look at my cloud application, that's a different attack surface than what we're referencing here. So if it's an implanted cardiac device, yeah, maybe we can easily make that SBOM available. But if it's like my cloud system that has, hundreds of APIs exposed and interfaces that, we need to consider, high potential with an attack surface of the internet, somebody could scan that. So again, it's going to be dependent on the attack surface to the point being made there.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. One that's come up recently in that, is there a limit to the value, right? There's some break point where we can provide this SBOM to you as a user, owner, operator of this device that has value to you so that you can take action, but there are certain levels of information that so increase the risk rather than reduce it. There's got to be some break point. I think those conversations are just now getting started. The cloud infrastructure one is a really good point.
Yeah. And I think there's some questions being put in here about like us being more transparent. I completely agree. Like I don't want to make this sound like combative in any way, but in some of the cases, the systems that are being put into these hospital IT environments are actually maintained by my Medtronic, my team, right? We maintain patches, updates. We maintain, security around the device and operating state. We're actually monitoring in many cases. So I would flip that around and say, would you give me the SBOM or the latest vulnerability scans of the entire VLAN that my device would be sitting on? I think that would be a hard no. So I think there's going to have to be some trade-off in some of these cases. Now, it's not one-to-one, but I think the transparency has to be trusted between both parties. And so I think we got to like flip that around and think about that specifically when we're looking at, well, why aren't we just giving everything out to anybody, right? Because I'm not going to be able to go to Amazon and say, give me all of your backplane scans and latest information around any weaknesses or vulnerabilities in your underlying cloud infrastructure, right? Likewise, I don't expect a hospital to give me the full readout on every possible scan and pen test that they've had. Usually you can get an attestation, you can get some of that. Again, SBOM is not one-to-one to that, but I think we got to think about a balance and transparency and again, where it makes the most sense.
Thomas, is your concern, I'm curious about that, the concern underlying your question about securing the SBOM as a continuation of security through obscurity. Valid point. I guess the idea of a solution that limits the information disclosure, so to speak, would include many different stakeholders, right? If I'm a user, like let's say it's a use, on patient device, like an insulin pump, right? I would be part of that. If I wanted to access the SBOM, I should be able to access the SBOM, right? So, as an example, right, the idea is just blasting out into the internet is less targeted, or providing it in public facing labeling. Are we striking the right balance risk? I don't know what the answer is, but the idea that there's some right threading the needle, I think seems right to me. That's the hypothesis, at least.
I think we agree that we need more transparency.
Yeah.
I think that is a general agreement across the board. I think, again, I was kind of trying to play the selfish manufacturer view and where we might see apprehension from our space, right? And it can't be just, oh, it's more work, but we need to understand kind of that balance.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, right? We don't want to get into it. It's such a nascent effort, and it's SBOM is a catalyst to so much. Just based on the conversation that we've had today, it's a catalyst, right? We don't want to limit or find ways to not do it. It seems like we should be doing it and going at it hard and figuring it out, because there's many more benefits than drawbacks. So we shouldn't be using, like, oh, what about unrestricted information disclosure as a reason not to. We should use it as a clarion call to be like, well, let's figure out a solution that satisfies Tom's point, and others that that have concerns. I think we can do that. So let's not use it as a way to diminish the effort. Not recognizing the risk, however, is something we don't need to. We shouldn't do either. We should figure it out. All right. So we are at 2:51. We got 9 minutes here. Feels like people are asking questions as they want. There's a couple questions about sort of tooling. GitHub Dependabot, right, does a really good job. I've looked at it a little bit. I don't think I've used it in practice, and I'm definitely somebody who learns by using something in practice, so I can't speak with authority on it. It does a good job, but there's a gap, right? In this case, package manager, some not supporting certain package managers. This has been my observation of tooling in general in the space, is there are really good tools that do a really good job for this piece of the pie, right? And the problem is this big. And I purposely put my arms outside of the screen, right? It's a large problem set. Is that been your observation as well, Kyle, or anything specific to Ed's comment there?
Yeah, no, I think traditional software, right? We could use a number of tools. We could automate a lot of it. We could put it into the build process. When we look at legacy, and that's something that I'm really passionate about, is not excluding products that are still being used today, no matter where they are in the world. It gets a lot more difficult, right? Where there's maybe been some design decisions or customizations, and creating that SBOM, it goes beyond even just binary analysis of the product, right? It goes beyond running it through something like a black duck, right? An artifact, or a traditional software dependency management or open source detection tool, even binary scanning, right? So I think that it's never, it's hard to find that one size fits all tool, and for various reasons. It's because of the complexity of our portfolio and our products.
Well said. It's a bit of an aside from Malind. How do you, Medtronic, go about selecting the appropriate cybersecurity software for your connected medical devices? I think we could probably just, port this to SBOM specifically. You mentioned, different tech stacks, and you guys have been customizing things, and that's making it hard where traditional tools break down, and you have to maybe even just do a manual build. Like, maybe you can talk about how you're thinking about this problem.
Yeah, I think what we need to be considerate of is platforms. It's something that took us a while to kind of get to, and we're making this decision to kind of align around platforms and ecosystem. And in that process, right, this is where we can become more standardized and less of every project's a special snowflake and has to have a different build and a different operating system and a different pattern. And so I think we're still along that journey where we're trying to develop ecosystem and consistency in things that we leverage from a dependency perspective. And so as we kind of move forward, that will improve. But we still have this debt that we're going to have to go back to. And I think that, it goes back to maybe the total cost of ownership and how do we quantify this longer term. That is still kind of a boat anchor around our leg until we obsolete that product or get it to a certain place where it really is obsolescence, right? That's going to kind of get us away from it. But we're still looking at having to build SBOM for all of that.
Well said. Question here about, I'll paraphrase here from Thomas. A list of software, the SBOM in general, is insufficient, right, to contextualize it for our customers.
Yes.
There's got to be some add-on to that, right? And just how do you feel about that? What do you
No, I 100% agree with that. I think that's where a lot of the work really starts to become important, is how do we contextualize it based on its operating environment, its use case, its additional controls, right, that might be built within the system. Again, like really going to a specific example, we've had Bluetooth vulnerabilities that we've been able to mitigate because of the design and architecture, right, and because of how we've built the actual components and the connection between the two components, right? So that contextualization is going to be added work, but I think we're going to have to work with the industry to understand what do the certain stakeholders want to see, because I can't have one-off calls with every IT security team in every hospital when there's a vulnerability, but we're going to have to leverage SBOM to be a catalyst to have that contextual discussion and that addition. And I mean, we talk about things like MDS2 or other additional asks that are coming from the industry. I'd like us to kind of start to really centralize around something, because if we're all going different routes, it's just we're gonna spin out of control and we're gonna have too much paperwork to really get there.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer, but I'm open for a lot of discussion around that, and it has to happen.
Yeah, just to point to two that I know of. One is there was I think Sonotype put forth I don't know what it's called exactly, to the Cyclone DX standard, basically saying, yeah, we need a place in the Cyclone DX standard for contextual information. I think they call it vulnerability exploitation or whatever. The NTIA and their effort around software transparency also came up with something called VEX, which is, interestingly enough, sounds like a portmanteau or contraction of vulnerability exploitability, to start to put some machine readable formatting around contextualizing information for vulnerabilities. Because to your point, Thomas, yes, we need to provide that because it's a key component of actionability, right, and transparency, right? So I think the industry is moving on that. I think we do need an industry effort. We have 2 minutes. Final thoughts. Okay, this is the last time we can ever talk about SBOM. No more conversation about SBOM after this, right? No, I'm obviously just joking. How long is this going to take, Kyle? And you will be held responsible for your answer. We will follow up with you, and however long you say, we're gonna have another webinar and see where we ended up.
Okay, well, I'll just say it's going to be an infinite, continuous process, right? So, and iterative development cycles, right, to get better. No, I think it's going to take a while, but I think we got to start now, right? For all the reasons that were discussed today, for all the points that are being made in the chat, and we need to establish trust along the way so that we can work as industry partners and peers, whether it's on the supplier side, on the medical device manufacturer side, on the regulatory side, on the customer side, right? Because the goal here is protecting these products and protecting the infrastructure where they reside. That should really be the end goal. And I mean, how we get there is going to take a lot of steps, and it's going to need to be refined, and it's going to be a journey. I know it's a cliche, but it's going to take time. And so I don't know if you can really hold me accountable to that answer.
Well, that was a perfect answer. So I mean, how can I say anything? I think that's a perfect way to end. I have nothing to add. Kyle, again, thank you for the discussion. I hope folks enjoyed, and feel free to reach out Kyle Erickson, the Medtronic CRM. I don't know if he'll publish. Well, I think in the registration link is probably our contact info. But get a hold of us, ask us questions. Appreciate the time. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Seth.